Hi, it's Charlton from the Sol Quartet, and this is an Angel Island bonus episode with someone who knows the island itself more intimately than anyone else in this podcast series. Casey Dexter-Lee is State Park Interpreter 2 on Angel Island, and in this clip, you'll hear more about what that actually means, and you'll hear what it's like to live on Angel Island now. Sol violinist Hyeyung Sol Yoon got to record this interview on site with Casey at the immigration station. They talked not only about the past and present of Angel Island, but why Casey believes it's important to preserve the island's legacy for future generations. You can learn more about visiting Angel Island State Park at parks.ca.gov and the Immigrant Voices project through the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation at aiisf.org. Linked for you in the episode description in your listening app. Of course, if you're new to Sounds Current, we invite you to scroll back and listen to Angel Island parts 1 through 4 right after you listen to Hyeyung's conversation with Casey.
We were wondering, what is your earliest memory of Angel Island?
So one of my earliest memories, I guess, is coming to a job interview at Angel Island. I didn't grow up in the Bay Area, although I did grow up in Northern California. And I wasn't familiar with Angel Island until I applied to work here. And I was finished with college and maybe floundering is the word. And just didn't know what to do with myself after my summer job was over. And we had a family friend that worked for state parks and mentioned that they are always looking for people. So I went to my local state park near where I grew up, which is Columbia State Historic Park. And I got a packet, which is papers that tell you about things. And so there was a job flyer for this job on Angel Island, being in charge of a living history program, an overnight field trip for mainly 4th and 5th graders based on the American Civil War. And so I came in and did the interview. And what a lot of people don't know is that I didn't get the job. And I went back home, and a few days later, my future boss called and said, "Hey, we're going to hire 2 people instead of 1. Are you still available?" And I said, "Yes, I can be there in 2 days." And he's like, "If you need more time, it's fine." I was like, "Nope, I'm not doing anything." And that was the beginning of my Angel Island journey. I still have photographs from that first visit when I did the job interview in a photo album, and took a little hike, and the island's changed a lot in the 23 years since I first came here. But it's a really great place, and I've really made my life here.
So can you tell us about your current role here at Angel Island? And what does it look like to other people? Yeah.
So my role on Angel Island is I'm a State Park Interpreter 2 for my title, but basically I'm the lead for all the education staff at the park, for the education programs. Because I have worked here a long time, I've had the opportunity to do all of those programs, and so I can help teach our staff and volunteers the different aspects of the recreational, natural, and cultural history of the park. I've been very fortunate to also be a part of kind of the bigger operation, and in part because I have been here so long, I have a lot of institutional knowledge for the park as well. So I try and help when there's questions about where does that water line go and how do we fix this, what do we have to do when there's a brownout in the park, and what ththings do we have to safeguard, and where are all the fire extinguishers? Because I've helped find them all at one point or another. We obviously have a maintenance team as well, but it's a small staff. So there's always opportunities for collaboration and helping each other with different aspects of the park. We also, if there's a medical emergency here, that's usually a team effort to get people to the help that they need, depending on where the incident has occurred in the park. So no 2 days are the same for sure. And that is part of the reason I think I have been here so long, is that not only are the day-to-day different enough to be interesting after 23 years, but also this park is so complex. In many other state parks, just one of our resources would be the entire park's resource. We sometimes refer to this park as being 5 parks in one because of the different cultural history and natural history and recreational opportunities. And so I'm still learning, and I like that. I like that I don't know everything. If I knew everything about this park, I might move on, but I don't see that ever happening. I have more and more to learn, and the immigration station is definitely the history that interests me most personally, and is a very difficult but inspiring story that I really hope that more and more people get to learn about.
Yeah. So to somebody who's, because, most of our audience is, they haven't been here, right? So for those people, what is it like to be on the island? Like the sounds, wildlife, plants, tourists, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm on Angel Island right now, so you might even hear some of the sounds of Angel Island in the background. There's some birds squawking and chirping. There's ravens and jays, and you might hear the waves lapping at the beaches. It is a real island, so to get here you have to get on a boat. So generally that's a ferry for most folks. We do have some slips if you have your own boat to come in as well, but most folks take the ferry either from San Francisco or Tiburon. So you're kind of leaving behind those big city noises when you come out here. You'll have kind of this boat ride that gives you a moment to transition to this different space. Even though we're in the middle of San Francisco Bay, it is a very different sound atmosphere here. And, we generally have a little bit of a breeze somewhere on the island. The immigration station's on the north side, which is the warmest side of the island. But we do have cars, but not too many. Actually, as I'm looking out over the water, I just saw a harbor porpoise come up for a breath. So you're definitely going to see some wildlife and nature. We have deer, raccoons, coyotes, obviously lots of birds. And we don't really have anything that's dangerous. I mean, poor decisions, I usually say, is the most dangerous thing on Angel Island. So as long as you're staying on the trails and roads, you're going to be in great shape. We do have some poison oak and ticks, which don't live in the middle of the trail. So if you're, again, on the trails, no issues there. But I think, especially for the immigration station, it's nice to have that walk over, because we're about a mile from where the ferry lands. And it kind of gives you some time to, again, between the ferry ride and the walk, kind of leave what you came with behind and kind of focus in on the experience here. And if you do come out to the park at the immigration station, we do have the fog bell. And so we encourage and welcome visitors to ring that. And that will give you a nice little sound of what that kind of history sounds like.
Can you describe to us what the immigration center kind of looks like and feels like?
So historically, the immigration station had its own dock, so ferries would have come directly here, but that dock isn't here anymore. So when you walk into the site, you're almost coming in the back way, and it's not the way immigrants would have arrived. So we really encourage people, if they have the time, to walk down to the water in the site and then come back into the site that way, so that you kind of mimic the arrival experience of people that were detained here, and so that you can kind of see the site through their eyes a little bit. The administration building in the center of the site burned down in 1940, and that's why the immigration station ultimately closed. There were many reasons. Immigration officials wanted it closed. Members of the public were interested in it being closed. But that fire was an accidental fire. It was kind of the thing that pushed it to finally being closed, and facilities moved to the mainland in San Francisco. But there's a big kind of open space where that building used to be, where we've built up the ground level to where the floor of that first floor of that building was. It's a kind of multi-tiered, so kind of 3 steps up, and then a covered wooden staircase. It was rebuilt that historically connected the administration building to the detention barracks. So the Detention Barracks Museum today is where most folks have their mindset on coming if they do have an idea of the immigration station. There are wooden structures here for the most part, and inside of the detention barracks, which is surrounded by a chain link fence with barbed wire at the top. So it very much is very visibly a detention facility. There's also kind of a chain mesh over the all of the windows. So even though it's this very idyllic and beautiful setting, it is a detention facility. That was what it was built to do. And so once you're inside the building, it's a little maze-like because it was built, in addition to detain, also to segregate. And so for the flow of a museum, it's not great. So we give people maps to help them navigate those internal spaces of the building. But there's kind of smaller rooms that were healthy for 25 to 30 people, but had beds for 50 to 60, and larger rooms that were healthy for 50 that held up to 200. And in those spaces, to be able to get that many people in the limited space of those rooms, there were bunk beds. And so we do have some reproduction bunk beds that visitors will see when they visit the museum. They're triple layer, so there's 3 levels of bunk beds. They're metal, and they're connected to poles that go from floor to ceiling. So those triple layer bunk beds actually are 6 beds between every set of poles, because basically the bed cantilevers out from that center post. So you would potentially be sleeping right next to someone that you don't know. And the beds are smaller than a twin bed, just under 6 feet, probably 5.5 feet in length, and maybe 3 feet wide. So they're not very big, and there's no ladders or anything. You actually step on the beds below you to get up to the upper bunks. And immigrants sometimes would tie strings between the poles above the beds to dry their laundry. There were no laundry facilities for personal items. The immigration facility did have laundry for the linens, but your own clothing you would wash in a sink in the bathroom, and people would hang things. And initially there were actually chandeliers in some of the rooms, and people were hanging laundry on that, so they removed the chandeliers to prevent fires. So in addition to the detention barracks, we have another building that's open to the public, which is the historic hospital. We now call it AIM, Angel Island Immigration Museum. And the exhibits in there focus on both historic and modern immigration. It's a very different look inside of AIM because that building was in a more deteriorated state when the restoration was done and has plaster walls. So most of the plaster was breaking or falling, so it was replaced. And so that building looks very new inside, and the exhibits are more bright and contemporary, kind of a more modern experience, versus the detention barracks where we've tried not to change too much on the inside because the writing on the walls left behind by detained immigrants is the key resource. The building is the resource. And so we haven't painted in there. The last layer of paint is from World War II, kind of a yellow and gray paint on the wooden walls. That was the bell.
Oh, that's the bell. Is that like a tour?
Yeah, so they do tram tours, and there's also a shuttle that is just a ride to the immigration station. So you get tickets at the cafe.
So like for, visitors, because I know most people come here for like recreation because it's so beautiful, but like what percentage of people do they actually visit immigration center?
We think it's around 10%.
10%, okay. Yeah.
A lot of that is school groups that are coming specifically for a field trip to the immigration station. But yeah, roughly, probably a little more than 10%.
How many people actually live on the island then?
There's a couple dozen people that live
okay.
on the island.
Okay.
It's park staff and our families. So permanent employees, our families can live here too.
Okay.
So the number fluctuates a lot depending on how big the families are.
Yeah.
So right now we have a couple families of 5. Okay. So it's a little higher total population. Actually, we might even be approaching 30 because we just got some new folks. And we have a pretty good size seasonal staff. And not everyone lives here full time. Some of the staff will just be here during their work week because they already lived locally. So they go home on their weekends, in part to avoid the commute because you do have to catch a boat to get here. And then we have a couple people that commute in and don't live in the park.
But what is it like to live here on the island for you?
I really like living on the island, and most of the time I love it. And it is not convenient for everything. It's commute convenient, but if you want food, it's not convenient. So there's no grocery store on Angel Island. There's a little seasonal cafe, where you could grab lunch or something, but we have to leave the island and the park to do errands and grocery shopping and things like that. So living here, you are limited by the boat schedules. The ferries are an option for us, but there's also a park boat that goes to Tiburon. So the park vessel goes at least twice a day in the winter, usually 3 or 4 times a day. And so you just have to time things very well. If you want a complicated purchase like ice cream, you have to do that right at the last second to kind of step on the boat and get it home to the freezer as fast as possible. Many of the people who live here own those kind of, if you will, soccer mom wagons, those collapsible wagons. And that's what you put your groceries in to move it from the car to the dock to the boat to another car, then to your house. So there's a lot of steps in kind of those day-to-day practicalities. But, we also have this amazing park as our backyard. And, I've been here most of my adult life. So this is definitely home for me. I met my husband here and got married here. And so I've had a chance to live in a few different houses over the years because I started as a seasonal employee. So I lived in the dorm setting and then became a permanent employee, had my own residence, and then eventually married. And so we are also in some ways kind of that neighborhood of the past. Like you can borrow a cup of sugar from your neighbor kind of place because you might not be able to go to the store to get a cup of sugar if it's after 5 p.m. So I have definitely borrowed and have given away, crucial recipe ingredients to neighbors. And it's in that way, it's really great. So especially when there's a time of crisis, like you might have a medical emergency, or bigger things like we've had fires on the island. There was an oil spill in the time that I've lived here in the San Francisco Bay. And we really come together because we know each other well. Sometimes you get maybe a little like your youth of, your small school or something where you know everything about everyone, even if you don't want to. But that also helps, when you need community to respond to something that's a big impact on the park. So
at this point, Hyeyung and Casey moved inside to talk about the discovery of the poems in the detention barracks and the preservation of the structures, which you can hear in parts 2 through 4 of the Angel Island series. In the meantime, here is more of the immigration history and Casey's vision for the future.
But I'm sure there's so many stories like that. Yeah. I've heard that there's so many stories.
Yeah, and about 1 million people were processed here. About half of those people are actually leaving the United States. And that's because if you wanted to get back in, you needed to make sure your documents were all in order so that you didn't end up detained on Angel Island when you returned. So about half of the people are coming in. Not all of those people physically came to the island because this was San Francisco's immigration station. So the paperwork would come here, but you might not be detained. So about 300,000 people, we think, were physically here on the island in the 30 years of operation. And, if you think about a fairly large percentage were allowed to come into San Francisco. The deportation rates are 2 to 3% for most immigrant groups that came through here from about 80 countries. Chinese immigrants have a higher deportation rate because of the Chinese exclusion laws. They were scrutinized more than typically other groups. So their deportation rate's right around 10%, a little less. So still pretty high successful entry numbers. Indian immigrants, their deportation rate's about 50%. They have the highest of all the groups. And so whatever the math ends up being, but, a lot of people got in and, all of their descendants, this place has touched so many generations of lives now. First opening in 1910, closing in 1940, most of the people that were detained here are not with us anymore. They've passed away, but there are a few people that are still able to tell their stories that were here as children. And so those are voices we really value and seek out, because we do want to make sure that if people are comfortable talking and remembering this part of their story, that gets recorded and shared. We have a great partner in the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, and they have an Immigrant Voices feature on their website. And its goal is to collect stories of immigration. And we use that term also very, very broadly, immigration, right? Today, people have many different ways that they come to the United States. It might be as a refugee or a student or whatever, the paperwork says, but we use that very broadly to just include everyone who is here. And those stories on the foundation's website don't exclusively have to be Angel Island. So if folks would like to tell their family story, that is a place where stories are being collected and shared, and a lot of classroom teachers use them for inspiring students to learn more about Angel Island, but also immigration in general.
I'm gonna look into that. Yeah. I want to have my story too then.
Yeah. Well, and the first performance also featured the Last Khoisan poets, and one of the editors of the book Island, which is a compilation of poems from the detention barracks and English translations from the original Chinese. And so because I've worked here a long time, I have had the opportunity to meet all three of those authors, but two of them, Judy Young and him, Mark Lai, have since passed away. And so having Jenny Lim here, especially for our newer staff, it's, those connections of like, oh, I use this book all the time. Like I don't, to be able to meet the person that was involved in sharing that story and making sure it was preserved and creating that resource, not just for members of the public, for the staff as well. Those are things that, again, people will remember maybe long after they've worked on Angel Island, but, it's just these amazing opportunities when we get to meet a former detainee or a descendant. So we do encourage you, tell us if you're comfortable, tell us your story and how you're connected here, because we will add that to our tour. A lot of our tours have personal stories threaded through that have been told to us from people that came to the park. I kind of think of it as if the immigration station closed in 1910 and you're old enough to remember being here, you were probably born about 1930. So those folks are 93, if that is math. And there's some that are a little younger, but they might not remember being here. Yeah, right. And then there's some that are a little older and, might have been here a little earlier or something like that. But it's a group that won't be here very much longer. I don't know if he has the record, but one of the oldest detainees that has since passed, but Tyrus Wong, I think he lived to be 106, and you can't really count on that for, connecting with people. But, we also recognize not everyone wants to talk about this, and that's okay too. It's hard. When I first started, there was a volunteer here who had been detained here as a teenager, Dale Ching, and he and his wife would come out every Thursday, and he would lead tours for kids on school field trips. And he was someone that did not want to come back here ever. He didn't want to talk about it. And his kids and grandkids got him to come out. And I, when I tell the story, I say, I honestly don't know if they told him where he was going before or after they got on the ferry, but because he had no interest in coming out here. And they kind of followed another group that was getting a tour around, and he talked to some of the kids about their tour, and they were very excited about the ferry ride and maybe not so excited about the history. And that's when he decided to become a docent and start leading tours himself, because he knew how important it was that people understand this story better. And he would show the kids where his bed was. And, that's hugely powerful, right? When you try and talk about history to young people, because they're young, history kind of is this compacted thing, right? George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were friends, right? they lived 100 years apart. They were not friends. Um, so, this story, when you start talking about the history of the Chinese exclusion law and in 1882 and the gold rush in the 1840s and 50s, for kids, that starts getting squished into Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, right? This is so long ago. But when you have someone standing in front of you and say, this happened to me, that makes it so much more real. Now we have kind of this second generation. So we have the descendants of people who are detained that represent a few of our volunteers, which again, if anyone would like to become a volunteer, we always need more volunteers to help us. And if you do have a personal connection to the site, we love for folks to incorporate that into their tour. We don't have a script. We have kind of points that we want to hit on our tours, but we really do want people to personalize their tours. And of course, we need to keep our audience in mind. We make adjustments to make sure that they have the best experience and feel connected to the site as well. But we have, I think, 5 volunteers right now that have either immediate family, parents, siblings, or I think one person, it was their uncle that was here. And even grandmother-in-law, I guess we have. So again, it's so much more powerful when someone can say, this happened to my person, my family. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking of even more. We have more. There's a few more. 6, 7 people, actually, I think.
So one last question. Is there a legacy you want to leave behind from your time, work, and dedication to the site?
I mean, my silly answer to the legacy I would like to leave behind is a clean office, and that is not where it is right now. And that's partially because I feel like I'm too busy to worry about cleaning my office. But I do kind of think about setting up systems to help the next generation of park staff. In state parks, we tend to do things a lot by institutional knowledge and like passing it on from person to person, but to make sure that we kind of have systems in place so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, I guess, with every new person that comes into a position. But more realistically, like that's the technical side of things, right? But realistically, the legacy I hope I leave behind is maybe of just like I don't know, I guess this is kind of personal, but just like the personal growth that I feel like I've had. And I hope others get to experience that. Or maybe they don't have to because they started in a better spot than I did. But, I came here when I was 24 and not long out of college and grew up in a very rural area without a lot of cultural diversity or ethnic diversity or economic diversity. It was a very kind of monoculture and there was some, but not a lot. And, just having, your eyes opened to the wider world and different experiences. I hope we all continue to, hear about the immigration station, and maybe it's not your story or your family's story, but, to take a moment and hear about someone else's experience and have some empathy for those experiences. But we also hope overall that when people visit the site, obviously we're a historic site, but we do have some more contemporary exhibits here as well. And we want that historic conversation to be a spark to talk about the immigration, whether it's law or immigrant communities in a more modern context as well, because it is a point of history that is not concluded. Immigration is something that's happening today. It's going to happen tomorrow. And one of the things that's very challenging around immigration in a modern context is that everyone agrees that they don't like how immigration works now. But very few people agree about how it should work. And so our hope is that people come to places like museums and California state parks and are inspired or maybe sparks a conversation, because that is how we address issues that we don't feel are working well is to communicate and have those conversations, and sometimes difficult conversations. And so that's why we want to have these safe spaces where that type of conversation can happen.
That's so great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Sounds Current is a production of the Del Sol Quartet and the Del Sol Performing Arts Organization. Del Sol is Catherine Bates, Benjamin Creeth, Hyeyung Sol Yoon, and me, Charlton Lee. This podcast is produced and edited by Andrea Klunder at the Creative Impostor Studios. Technical direction by Edwin R. Ruiz. Additional production support from Alex Riegler. Cover art by Felicia Lee. Our theme music was composed by me and performed by Del Sol Quartet. Angel Island was composed by Huang Ruo with generous funding from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, with additional funding from the Phyllis C. Wattis Foundation and the Clarence E. Heller Charitable Foundation. Special thanks to Andrea Fellows-Feinberg and Don Feinberg, who believe our stories are worth sharing. And thank you to all of our guests and collaborators in the ever-expanding world of Angel Island. You can find links to all of the resources and partners mentioned in this episode in the show notes in the episode description in your app and at delsolquartet.com/podcast. To learn more about Del Sol Quartet and the Angel Island Project, visit delsolquartet.com.